The wind had a name in this part of the country, dust. It was not a gentle name. Whispered on a breeze, it was a curse, hissed through cracked lips and scoured across a brittle land. Late in the decade of the 1880s, along the newly laid spine of the Santa Fe Railroad, the town of Dustwater did its best to forget it was dying of thirst. The drought was a slow fever, leaving the earth pale and cracked. The sky, a vast and unforgiving canvas of bleached blue, rarely offered clouds. Only the churning brown fists of dust storms that rose from the plains like angry ghosts. Hartman Ranch was tucked into a valley that seemed to funnel that very wind, a narrow crease in the land where the soil was more gravel than earth. The creek that cut through it was a seasonal lie, a ribbon of damp sand for half the year. In the town of Dustwater itself, life clung to a few simple structures, a saloon where whispers were traded louder than coin, a wooden church with a leaning steeple, the sheriff's office, a blacksmith's forge that rang with the stubborn pulse of survival, and a small clinic that smelled of carbolic acid and quiet despair. Ara Langley felt the grit of that dust between her teeth. At 22 years old, she had learned the taste of endings. She sat on the hard bench of a freighter's wagon, her hands resting in her lap, still and composed. It was a stillness born not of peace, but of a carefully built wall against the world. She was the daughter of a farmer from the southeast, a place that seemed a world away now, a land of soft green hills and damp air that did not try to flay the skin from your bones. In that other world, she had collapsed once in the local doctor's office, a simple fainting spell from the summer heat. But the examination had led to questions, and the questions had led to a single word written in a ledger, a word that had followed her ever since Barren. It was a brand, invisible but heavier than any iron. It had turned her from a daughter into a burden, a field that would not yield. Her silence was often mistaken for simplicity, but behind her calm gray eyes, Ara's mind was sharp. She saw the way the wind bent the tough grasses. She noted the salt deposits that crusted the edges of dry puddles. And she understood, with a farmer's instinct, the language of a struggling land. Her journey west was not one of hope, but of transaction. Her family, choked by debt, had made a deal. They had traded their barren daughter for a chance to save their fertile land. Now, she carried the wound not of the bargain, but to her own sense of self. Her deepest desire was not for a husband or a home, but for a place to stand where her worth was not measured by her womb. She needed to quiet the voice in her own head, the one that whispered she was valueless. The man waiting at the edge of town was Cole Hartman. At 32, he moved with the economy of a man who wasted nothing, not words, not motion, not emotion. His face was weathered by the same sun and wind that punished the land, his eyes the color of a winter sky. A widower, he ran the ranch alone, a place haunted by the memory of a wife lost to a blizzard years ago. That loss had forged his principles in iron. He was a former cavalryman, and he had seen enough of men being treated like property. His creed was simple: you do not buy people, you only buy their freedom. He was in Dustwater not to acquire a wife, but to settle a debt. His own motivations were as harsh and real as the landscape. He needed to keep his ranch from succumbing to the drought, to pay his own loan to the town bank, and to never again make a mistake that would cost someone their life. The forces working against them were as real as the dust. There was the unwritten law of the West, a social contract that valued a woman primarily for the sons she could provide. Then there were the men who gave that law a face. Banker Reed, a man whose smile was as thin as a razor, held the notes on half the county. Pike McCready, a cattle baron with an appetite for land and water, saw Hartman's ranch as a key piece in his growing empire. And somewhere, back east, was the shadow of Dr. Townley, the man who had first written the word that had condemned Ara. The freight wagon creaked to a halt near the blacksmith's shop, the rhythmic clang of the hammer a stark counterpoint to the tense silence. The driver, a portly man named Silas, hopped down, his face slick with sweat and greed. He gestured toward Ara as if she were a prize mare. "Here she is. Hartman. Sound and strong. Good for work. Comes with a signed agreement." Cole Hartman did not look at Silas. His gaze rested on Ara for a moment, not with the appraising eye of a buyer, but with a quiet, unreadable intensity. He saw the proud set of her shoulders, the rigid control in her hands. He saw the wall she had built. He dismounted his horse, his movements deliberate. "Show me the paper," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Silas chuckled, pulling a folded document from his coat. "It is all legal and binding. A debt paid in kind. You pay the balance, and she is yours." Cole took the paper. He read it slowly, his expression unchanging. It was a promissory note, signed by Ara's father, the debt secured by the service of his daughter. It was a piece of paper that turned a woman into chattel. "How much to clear the note?" Cole asked, his eyes still on the document. $50, Silas said, rubbing his hands together. "A bargain for a healthy woman." Cole looked up, his gaze finally meeting the merchant's. "I am not buying a woman. I am paying a debt." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted out the coins, the silver glinting in the harsh sunlight. He placed the money in Silas's outstretched hand. Then, he did something Silas did not expect. He held out his other hand. "The note," Cole said. Silas, confused, handed it over. Cole took the paper, folded it once, and tucked it into his own shirt pocket. He then looked at Ara, truly looked at her for the first time. "The debt is paid," he said to her, his voice devoid of any false sentiment. "You are free to go wherever you wish." Ara stared at him. The words did not register at first. They were a language she had forgotten. Free. The word was a hollow sound, an empty vessel. She had been prepared for a new master, a new set of chores, a new life of servitude. She was not prepared for a choice. Silas's face turned a blotchy red. "What is this? That is not the deal. You bought the girl. She is your property." "I bought a piece of paper," Cole replied, his voice flat and cold as stone. "The paper is mine. The woman is her own." He turned his back on the sputtering merchant and walked toward his horse. He swung himself into the saddle, then paused, looking back at Ara, who had not moved. She sat frozen on the wagon bench, a solitary figure against the backdrop of a town that had already begun to whisper. "You can stay on the wagon and have him take you to the next town," Cole said, his voice carrying easily in the dry air. "Or you can come to my ranch. You would earn a wage. The choice is yours." He did not wait for an answer. He nudged his horse and began to ride out of town, a straight-backed, solitary figure moving toward the wind-scoured valley. Ara watched him go. Freedom. The word echoed in the vast, empty space that had just opened up in her life. She looked at Silas, whose face was a mask of fury. She looked at the dusty street, at the curious faces peering from the saloon doors. And she thought, what good is freedom to a broken thing? To be free and worthless was perhaps a crueler fate than to be owned and have a purpose, however grim. The whispers in Dustwater started before Cole's horse had even cleared the last building. They said he was a fool. They said he had taken on a burden. They said Cole Hartman had just bought himself a whole lot of trouble. Ara heard none of it, but she felt it in the air. She felt the weight of their judgment, another layer of dust settling on her soul. She looked down the road after Cole, then back at the leering face of Silas. There was no good choice here. There was only the wind, and the dust, and the crushing weight of a word she could not escape. Ara slid off the wagon bench, her boots landing softly in the thick dust of the street. She did not give the merchant, Silas, the satisfaction of a backward glance. Her legs felt stiff, her whole body an ache of travel and tension. Before her, the road stretched out, a pale, dusty track winding toward the low hills. It was the path Cole Hartman had taken. The other direction led back east, a journey she could not afford and a life she could not reclaim. So she began to walk. Each step was a deliberate choice, a severing of the past. The dust puffed up around her ankles, clinging to the hem of her simple dress. The walk to Hartman Ranch was longer than she expected. The sun beat down, and the wind was a constant, dry whisper against her skin. When she finally saw the ranch, it was not grand. It was a collection of sturdy, unpainted buildings huddled together as if for warmth, a testament to function over form. A lone windmill turned with a rhythmic, mournful creak. Cole was by the corral, mending a fence post. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. He did not seem surprised to see her. "I will work," she said, her voice a little hoarse from the dust. It was not a question. It was a statement of terms, to pay for the $50, and for my keep. Cole drove a nail into the post with a single, efficient blow. He set the hammer down before turning to face her. "I told you the debt was paid." "You paid it," she corrected him gently. "I did not. I am not good at accepting favors, only at repaying debts." A flicker of something, perhaps understanding, passed through his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Then we will get along. I hate being indebted, too." He led her to the main house. It was sparse inside, clean but lived in by a man who did not notice dust in the corners or the lack of curtains on the windows. He showed her a small room off the kitchen. It had a narrow bed with a patched quilt and a single window that looked out over the parched valley. "You can cook for me in the hands," he said. "Tend the horses. I will teach you to ride properly. We will keep a ledger. Your wages against what you owe. Your name on the top." He paused, his gaze steady and serious. "Here, everyone is called by their name." Ara felt a strange tightness in her throat. Her name, for so long. She had been a daughter, a problem, a commodity, to be Ara Langley. An employee with a ledger in her own name felt like a promotion she had never dared to imagine. The first few days were a blur of work that left her muscles screaming in protest. She rose before the sun, her hands quickly becoming chapped and calloused from the lye soap and the rough leather of the horse tackle. The ranch hands, a small group of wiry, quiet men, watched her with a wary curiosity. They ate her cooking without complaint, but their conversations would stop when she entered a room. She was an outsider, a puzzle they had not yet solved. In town, the puzzle was being solved for them. A piece of paper, crudely lettered, was tacked to the wall in the saloon, a girl bartered for debt. The word spread through dust water like a grass fire. When Ara rode into town with Cole for supplies, she felt the stares. They were not just curious, they were dismissive, some laced with a vulgar pity. She was seen as an object, a piece of property that had changed hands. She kept her chin high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but each stare was a small paper cut on her soul. Sheriff Maeve O'Rourke saw the notice and tore it down herself. She was a woman who had buried a husband and had no patience for the cruelties of men. She rode out to the Hartman Ranch that afternoon, her horse kicking up a cloud of dust that announced her arrival. She was a tall woman, with clear, direct eyes and a no-nonsense set to her jaw. "Cole," she said, dismounting before he could help her, "you are stirring a hornet's nest." "I just paid a man's debt." "Maeve," he replied, leaning against the corral fence. "You brought a woman here under circumstances that give gossips a feast," she countered. "That is trouble enough. But Pike McCready is the real problem. He wants your water. I have heard whispers he has been making friends with potential jurors over at the county seat. Do not give him an excuse to make your life harder." "I will keep that in mind," Cole said, his tone giving nothing away. Maeve's gaze softened slightly as she looked toward the house, where Ara was hanging laundry on a line. "She looks like she can handle herself." "She can," Cole said, and the simple affirmation hung in the air with a weight of certainty. A few weeks later, Ara proved him right. A young boy named Eli, who helped herd the cattle, was trying to move a stubborn steer away from the nearly dry creek bed. The animal, irritable from the heat and thirst, suddenly lowered its head and charged. The other hands were too far away to intervene. Ara was walking back from the chicken coop. She did not scream. She did not run. Instead, she dropped her basket and grabbed a long, fallen branch. She ran not at the steer, but at a sharp angle, slamming the branch against a large boulder at the side of the path. The sharp crack echoed through the valley. The steer, startled by the sudden, sharp noise from its flank, faltered in its charge, turning its massive head toward the sound. That moment of hesitation was all Eli needed to scramble up the creek bank to safety. The steer snorted, shook its head, and lumbered away. Cole had seen the whole thing from the barn. He walked over to where Ara stood, her chest rising and falling from the exertion. The ranch hands were gathering, their expressions a mixture of shock and newfound respect. "You were a farmer's daughter," Cole stated, his eyes searching hers. "We had stubborn animals," Ara replied simply, her composure returning. She left it at that, but a small seed of respect had been planted. She was not just the bartered woman. She was the woman who had faced down a charging steer without flinching. Yet, inside her, the old wound still festered. The word Barren was a splinter lodged deep in her heart. In town, the sound of a child's laughter could make her physically recoil, a knot of grief and shame tightening in her stomach. She saw mothers with their children and felt like a ghost, an observer of a world she was not allowed to enter. She was a field that would not grow, a tree that would not bear fruit. The respect of the ranch hands was a balm, but it could not heal the core of her pain. The past arrived one afternoon in the form of a man on a buggy. One of the hands, Jacob, had gashed his leg badly on a piece of rusty wire. Cole sent for the doctor from a neighboring town, a man known for being more competent than the one in Dustwater. When the buggy pulled up, Ara was coming out of the house with a basin of clean water. Her blood ran cold. It was Dr. Townley, the same man who, years ago, had looked at her with clinical pity and written her off as a failure. He recognized her immediately. A smug, knowing smile touched his lips. He was a man who enjoyed being right. As he passed her on his way to the bunkhouse, he paused. Well, he said, his voice low and condescending. "Still chasing a cure out here in the dirt. Are we some conditions, my dear, are permanent?" Ara froze, the basin trembling in her hands. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, filled with his quiet mockery. Before she could find her voice, Cole stepped out of the barn. He had heard. He moved to stand between Ara and the doctor, his presence a solid wall. He looked down at the smaller man, his face hard as granite. "Here," Cole said, his voice dangerously quiet. "A diagnosis is not a life sentence." Dr. Townley's smile vanished. He stammered a reply and hurried into the bunkhouse. Suddenly, all business. Ara looked at Cole, a storm of emotions swirling inside her. For the first time, someone had stood with her against the shadow that had defined her. He had not offered pity. He had offered a shield. The true conflict, however, came not from the past, but from the land itself. The creek that watered the Hartman Ranch originated on public land before flowing through the valley. It was the ranch's lifeblood. One morning, the flow was weaker, a mere trickle over the stones. Cole rode upstream to investigate. A few miles north, he found it, a new, crudely built dam of earth and rock, diverting the bulk of the water into a holding pond. The hoof prints around the site were fresh. They belonged to Pike McCready's men. Cole returned to the ranch, his jaw tight with a cold fury. This was more than a casual act of greed. It was a declaration of war. Without that water, his cattle would die, his land would turn to desert, and banker Reed would own him. That evening, he gathered the hands. "McCready has dammed the creek. I am riding to the county seat tomorrow to file a formal complaint on the water rights." Ara, who had been listening from the doorway of the cookhouse, stepped forward. "I will go with you," she said. Cole turned to her, a question in his eyes. "That paper," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The one my father signed. It is not right. His signature. It was not his own. It was the hand of a man who is being forced. I want to file a petition to have it nullified. I want my name cleared, not just in a ledger, but by the law." Cole looked at her for a long moment, seeing the steel that had been forged in her quiet suffering. He saw a woman who was done being defined by others. She was ready to claim her own story. He gave a single, decisive nod. "Get ready to ride at dawn." The journey to the county seat would have to wait. A single pressing reality overshadowed all legal matters. The ranch was dying of thirst. The trickle in the creek bed was not enough for the cattle, let alone the horses or the small vegetable patch Ara had tried to coax from the unforgiving soil. The men's faces were grim, their movements slow and heavy with a sense of impending doom. Cole was taut as a wire, his silence deeper and more troubled than usual. Ara watched him, but she also watched the land. During her walks to gather what few hardy herbs grew near the house, she studied the ground with the ingrained knowledge of someone whose survival had once depended on the whims of the earth. She saw things the cattlemen missed. One afternoon, she stood on a low rise, a patch of gravelly soil that everyone ignored. It looked barren, even more so than the surrounding pasture. But Ara saw the fine, white tracery of salt that crusted the pebbles, a ghostly map left by water that had evaporated long ago. She remembered her father, in a year of drought back home, saying that where salt lies on the surface, sweet water often sleeps below. She found Cole by the windmill, which was turning with a useless, metallic sigh. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "There is a spot up on the south ridge, the gravelly one. It has salt lines. My father used to say that is a good sign for digging." He looked at her, then at the ridge. His eyes narrowed with skepticism. The ranch hands who were nearby exchanged doubtful glances. Digging a well was back-breaking work, a gamble they could not afford to lose. "We have tried digging before. One of the men, a wiry old-timer named Silas, muttered, 'This valley is mostly rock.'" "This spot is different," Ara insisted, a flicker of her old resolve in her eyes. "The rock is broken there, like something pushed it up from underneath." Cole considered her words, his gaze moving from her earnest face to the desolate ridge. He saw not a foolish hope, but a calculated observation. He had his own knowledge, born of scouting for the cavalry, and he knew that sometimes the most unlikely places held a secret. He gave a sharp, decisive nod. "We will try it. We have more to lose by doing nothing." The work was brutal. For 2 days, the clang of pickaxes against stone was the only break in the wind's constant moan. Ara worked alongside them, hauling buckets of rock and dirt, her arms and back aching with a fire she had not felt since her days in the fields. And on the 3rd day, the miracle happened. The dirt at the bottom of the hole turned dark and damp. An hour later, they had a muddy, but steady, seep of water. It was not a river, but it was life. The mood on the ranch lifted, a collective sigh of relief that was more potent than any celebration. Ara had not just found water, she had earned a new kind of respect, one that had nothing to do with her past. Cole began to treat her less as an employee and more as a partner in the ranch's survival. One afternoon, he brought out a Winchester rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth with use. He set up a few empty tins on a fence post. "The wolves get bolder when the water is scarce," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "You should know how to make them think twice." He was a patient teacher, showing her how to hold the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to breathe out slow as she squeezed the trigger. Her first shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dust. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, but she did not complain. She listened, adjusted her stance, and fired again. The tin can jumped off the post with a satisfying clang. He did not praise her, but she saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. It was better than praise. A few days later, she had the chance to teach him something. The sky began to turn a sickly yellow-brown, the color of old bruises. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell silent, an eerie, expectant hush falling over the valley. "Dust storm," Cole said, his eyes on the horizon. A bad one. The preparations were a controlled frenzy. The men rushed to herd the cattle into a sheltered canyon, while Cole and Ara worked to secure the house and barn. They hammered boards over the windows and stuffed rags into the cracks around the doors. Just as they were leading the last of the horses into the relative safety of the barn, the storm hit. It was not wind. It was a solid, roaring wall of dirt that blotted out the sun and turned the world into a suffocating, brown twilight. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay and nervous animals. Cole was about to head back to the house when Ara stopped him, holding out a large, damp burlap sack. "Wrap this around your head," she said over the roar of the wind. "It will help you breathe, and it keeps the fine dust from getting in your lungs and making you sick." It was a trick from her childhood, a simple piece of farm wisdom. Cole looked at the sack, then at her, and did as she said. The short walk to the house was a battle, the wind trying to tear the sack from his face, but he could feel the difference. The air he breathed was still gritty, but it was not the choking powder that filled the outside world. They spent the night in the small kitchen, the storm howling like a demon outside. The fine silt found its way through every crack, coating the floor and furniture with a fine, brown powder in the flickering lamplight. Ara moved with a calm efficiency, making coffee, checking on the water barrels, speaking in a low, soothing voice that seemed to keep the panic at bay. For the first time, Cole saw the men looking to her not just for food, but for direction. She had become an anchor in the storm. When the wind finally died down the next morning, the world outside was transformed. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of dust. The landscape softened and muffled, as if by a brown snow. The air was cold and damp. That evening, Cole began to cough. It was a deep, racking cough that came from his chest, an old wound from his cavalry days. A piece of shrapnel still lodged near his lung always troubled him in the damp cold. By nightfall, he was feverish. Ara took charge. She sent one of the hands to town for medicine and set a pot of thin broth to simmer on the stove. She bathed Cole's face with cool water and sat by his bed through the night, listening to his ragged breathing. In his fevered state, he spoke of snow and of a woman named Sarah, his late wife. Ara listened without judgment, her heart aching with a strange mix of sorrow for his loss and a burgeoning tenderness she did not dare to name. She was no longer just a worker tending to her boss. She was a woman caring for a man who was, in his own quiet way, as wounded as she was. He was better in a few days, weak but clear-headed. He did not speak of the night he was sick, but something had shifted between them. The distance had closed. A few evenings later, they sat on the porch, the air finally clear and cool. The sky was a vast expanse of dark velvet, splattered with a breathtaking spray of stars. "Back home," Ara said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "We did not see so many stars. The air was too thick with moisture." She pointed to a cluster of bright points. "I used to pretend they had names. That one is the cooking pot, and over there, that is the broken fence." Cole was silent for a long moment, and she thought perhaps she had said something foolish. Then she heard a low sound and realized he was chuckling, a quiet, rusty sound, as if from disuse. "I am not sure the stars have names," he said, his voice laced with a gentle humor, "but I think you just named the whole sky." In that moment, under the vast, silent canopy of the heavens, a fragile peace settled between them. But the world outside the ranch had not changed. The following Sunday, Ara rode into town for flour. The church bell was ringing. and she saw the townspeople filing in. The priest's voice drifted out through the open doors. His words carried on the breeze. He was speaking of Eve's transgression and the sacred duty of women to bear children, to redeem that original sin through motherhood. Ara stopped, the bag of flour heavy in her arms. The words were not aimed at her, but they struck her like stones. She saw some of the women glance in her direction, their faces a mixture of pity and piety. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her face a mask of composure. She would not argue. She would not make a scene. She would simply endure. That night, back in her small room, she lit a candle. She took out the ledger where Cole kept track of her wages. On a clean page in the back, she began to write. It was not a diary of feelings, but a journal of labor. Mended 3 shirts, replaced 2 fence posts, cooked for 5 men, found water. Each entry was a small act of defiance, a testament to her worth. She was building a case for her own existence, one chore at a time. The attack came without warning. Late one night, a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, split the silence. It was the sound of a fence wire snapping. Then another, and another. A low rumble grew into a thundering roar. Stampede Cole yelled, bursting from his room. McCready's men had cut the wires to the main corral. The cattle, terrified and disoriented, were pouring out onto the open range, running blindly into the darkness. It was a disaster that could ruin the ranch in a single night. Ara was already pulling on her boots. She and Cole, along with the other hands, spent the rest of the night on horseback, riding through the darkness, their lanterns casting wild, bouncing shadows. They were a small group against a sea of panicked animals, their shouts hoarse as they tried to turn the herd, to contain the chaos. By dawn, they had managed to round up most of the cattle. They were exhausted, covered in sweat and grime. As the first light spread across the valley, they saw the full extent of the damage. The corral was destroyed. Worse, the creek, their precious, hard one trickle of water, was trampled and muddied, the flow even weaker than before, and in the soft earth near the broken fence, they found what they knew they would find: the deep tracks of shod horses, leading north, straight toward McCready's illegal dam. The ride to the county seat was a long one, marked by a shared silence that was not empty, but filled with the weight of their purpose. They rode side by side, 2 solitary figures moving through a vast, indifferent landscape. Ara had learned to ride with a natural grace, her body moving in rhythm with the horse, a stark contrast to the stiff, frightened woman who had first arrived in Dustwater. Cole watched her from the corner of his eye, noting the quiet competence that had become her hallmark. The county courthouse was a stern brick building that seemed to disapprove of the dusty town it governed. Inside, it smelled of old paper and stale tobacco smoke. The clerk, a man with a green eye shade and an impatient air, listened to Cole's complaint about the illegal dam with a practiced boredom. He stamped a form and pushed it back across the counter. When they went to the bank to make a payment on Cole's loan, they found Banker Reed behind his polished desk. He greeted Cole with a smile that did not reach his eyes. His gaze slid to Ara, lingering for a moment with an unpleasant curiosity. "I trust the ranch is prospering, Mr. Hartman," Reed said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "It would be," Cole replied, his tone level, "if my water was not being stolen." Reed steepled his fingers, his expression one of mock sympathy. "Water is a difficult business. It has a way of flowing toward those who are in good standing. A man who meets his obligations on time tends to find his streams run true." The threat was as clear as if he had shouted it. He was tied to McCready. After they left the bank, Ara's resolve had hardened. She found Sheriff Maeve O'Rourke in her small, tidy office. Ara placed the promissory note her father had signed on the desk. "I want to file a petition," Ara said, her voice clear and without a trace of a tremor. "This agreement was made under duress. It is not a valid contract. It is a bill of sale for a human being." and I want it struck from any record." Maeve read the document, her lips tightening into a thin line. She looked up at Ara, her eyes filled with a new level of respect. This was not a victim seeking pity. This was a woman demanding justice. Maeve took out a fresh piece of paper and a pen. She dipped the pen in ink and began to write, her script firm and decisive. When she was done, she pushed the document toward Ara to sign. Then Maeve took her official stamp and brought it down on the paper with a satisfying thud. "It is filed," she said. "The circuit judge will see it when he comes through next month." The victory felt clean and bright, a single point of light in a darkening world. But the darkness closed in quickly. By the time they returned to Dustwater, a new rumor had already taken root, a poisonous weed that grew from the seed of the old one. It was whispered in the saloon, over laundry lines, and behind cupped hands in the general store. The words were ugly and intended to wound Cole Hartman had not bought the Barren girl for work. He had bought her to warm his bed. Ara felt the sting of it in the way people's eyes slid away from hers, in the snickers she heard from a group of men loafing outside the saloon. The words were a brand, searing her with a shame that was not hers to bear. She kept her silence, her face a calm, unreadable mask. But inside, a cold knot of pain tightened. Cole heard the whispers too. His face became a thundercloud, his hands tightening on his saddle reins. But he said nothing. That evening, as they sat on the porch, Ara finally broke the silence. "You should deny it," she said softly, her gaze on the darkening hills. "You should not let them say such things about you." Cole was quiet for a long time, watching the first stars appear. "The truth needs time and space to grow." "Ara," he said, his voice a low rumble, "it does not need noise." His quiet certainty was a comfort. But the rumor lingered. It seemed to tap into his own deep well of pain, a place he kept hidden from the world. A few nights later, a sudden cold snap descended on the valley. Cole's cough returned, a harsh, ragged sound in the quiet house. As Ara brought him a hot drink, she saw a look in his eyes she had never seen before, a haunted, distant sorrow. He was staring out the window, but she knew he was seeing a different time, a different storm. He had never spoken of his wife. Sarah. The ranch hands only knew she had died. But now, in the quiet of the night, fragments of the story surfaced. She had been determined, he said, and full of life, when a blizzard had trapped them. Their supply of medicine for her lung sickness had run low, against his desperate pleas. She had insisted on riding to the next town for more, convinced a break in the storm was coming. He had been checking the fences on the far side of the ranch, and by the time he returned, she was gone. They found her the next day, not a mile from the house, her horse standing vigil, the blizzard having returned with a sudden, vicious fury. "I should have been here," he whispered, his voice thick with a guilt that years had not eased. "I should have stopped her." Ara saw it then, the source of his fierce, protective nature, his need to control the uncontrollable. He was a man living with the ghost of a mistake he could never undo. She simply sat with him, her presence a quiet testament of understanding, until the sorrow in his eyes retreated back to its hidden place. A letter arrived the following week, carried by a rider from the railroad depot. It was addressed to the town of Dustwater, but the postmaster, knowing its subject, sent it out to the Hartman ranch. The handwriting was her father's, with trembling hands. Ara opened it. It was not a letter to her, but a public confession of sorts. He wrote of his crushing debt, of the banker's threats, of his belief in Dr. Townley's damning diagnosis. He had believed he was sending his daughter to a place where, even if she could not be a wife and mother, she could at least be useful. It was the letter of a desperate man, trying to justify an act he knew was wrong. Ara read it twice, the flimsy paper crinkling in her grasp. There was no anger in her, only a profound and weary sadness. She folded the letter and put it away. She would not let his weakness define her future. The fight for the ranch had to be more than just a waiting game for the circuit judge. Maeve O'Rourke rode out again, this time with a plan. "The law needs proof. Cole," she said, her tone all business, "your word against McCready's is not enough. We need evidence that his men were on your land." She looked toward the blacksmith's forge, where Jonas, a man with one eye and arms like tree trunks, was hammering a glowing piece of iron. "Those boot prints you found. Jonas is clever with molds. Let us give the judge something he can hold in his hand." The idea was a spark of hope. Jonas, whose loyalty to Cole was as solid as the anvils he worked on, agreed at once. He made a careful plaster cast of the clearest boot print left by the stampede, a unique pattern with a worn heel. It was a tangible piece of the crime. In town, Ara found a small, but growing, circle of allies. Marisol, the fiery woman who ran the small Mexican eatery, became a fast friend. She had no time for gossip and judged people on the quality of their character, not the contents of their womb. "In Dustwater," Marisol said with a wry smile as she served Ara a plate of beans and rice, "a rumor travels faster than the mail coach." Ara found a smile of her own. "Then we will let them eat dust," she replied. The church decided to hold a small fall festival, a way to lift the spirits of a town worn down by drought and hardship. The centerpiece was a cornbread baking competition. At Marisol's urging, Ara entered. Her recipe was simple, one her mother had taught her, but she baked it with a focused care, a quiet rebellion against the whispers that defined her. When the judge, the mayor's wife, tasted her entry, her eyes widened. The cornbread was moist and flavorful, a small, perfect piece of comfort. Ara won the blue ribbon. It was a small thing, a silly competition. But as she accepted the prize, she'd heard genuine applause. For a moment, the whispers were replaced by smiles. She was not the Barren woman. She was the woman who baked the best cornbread in town. The victory, however, was short-lived. The next afternoon, as she was leaving the general store, a group of McCready's men blocked her path. They were drunk, their faces flushed with cheap whiskey and casual cruelty. "Look here," one of them sneered. "It is Hartman's $50 prize. Tell us, girl, is he getting his money's worth?" Ara froze, her heart pounding. Before she could speak, Cole was there. He had come from the blacksmith's shop, and he moved with a swift, deadly quietness. He did not touch the men. He simply stood in front of Ara, a shield of solid muscle and cold fury. "Around here," Cole said, his voice low and cutting, "women walk on the road, not on the auction block. Move." There was something in his voice, a finality that brooked no argument. The men grumbled, but they stepped aside. Cole walked with Ara back to their wagon, his presence a silent, unwavering promise of protection. The final escalation came a few days later. A formal notice arrived from Reed's Bank. Due to the diminished value of the ranch, a consequence of the reduced water flow and loss of cattle in the stampede, the full balance of Cole Hartman's loan was now due. He had 30 days to pay. If he could not, the bank would foreclose. The trap had been sprung. Without water, the ranch would die. And without the ranch, he would lose everything. The foreclosure notice from the bank lay on the kitchen table, a single sheet of paper that weighed more than an anvil. 30 days. It was a death sentence for the ranch, and everyone knew it. The temporary well Ara had found provided just enough for the animals to drink, but the pastures were turning to brown crisps under the relentless sun. The mood on the ranch was a low, simmering despair. The men worked with their heads down, the easy banter between them gone, replaced by a grim, watchful silence. Ara refused to surrender to it. Despair was a luxury she had never been able to afford. While the men saw a dying pasture, she saw the faint slope of the land. She walked the property for a full day, her eyes scanning not for grass, but for contour. She came back to the house as the sun was setting, her hands dusty and her mind clear. She found Cole by the corral, staring out at the cattle. His shoulders slumped with the weight of his looming failure. "There is no time to dig another well," she said, "not as a statement of defeat, but as a fact to be dealt with. But we do not need to. The well we have is higher than the north pasture. If we can get the water there, we can save at least that much grass for the calves." With what he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We have no pipe." "We have trees," she answered simply, "and axes. We can build troughs, split the logs, hollow them out, and lay them end to end. It will be slow. It will leak. But some of the water will get there, and some is better than none." It was a desperate, back-breaking plan. But it was a plan. For the first time in days, a flicker of light returned to Cole's eyes. The next morning, the ranch echoed with the rhythmic thud of axes. Ara worked alongside the men. Her hands, which had just begun to soften, were soon raw again. She learned to swing an adze, hollowing out the split logs, the wood chips flying, clinging to her hair and clothes. Her hands blistered, broke open, and bled. She wrapped them in rags and kept working. She was not just a cook or a helper anymore. She was a leader. Her quiet determination more effective than any shouted order. They laid the crude wooden aqueduct across the thirsty land, a long, clumsy snake of hollowed logs. When they finally let the water in from the well, it was a moment of supreme tension. It leaked from every joint, precious dark patches spreading in the dust. But a small, steady trickle made it to the end, spilling out onto the cracked earth of the north pasture. It was a tiny victory, but it felt monumental. Ara looked at the life-giving water, then at her own bleeding hands, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a smile touch her lips, genuine and unforced. The sky, as if angered by their small defiance, began to change. A week later, heavy, bruised-colored clouds gathered on the horizon, not the brown of dust, but the deep gray of rain. A low rumble of thunder echoed through the valley. The first drops fell, large and fat, hitting the dust and releasing the rich, loamy scent of the earth. It was a blessing, a reprieve they had prayed for. But the blessing quickly turned. The drizzle became a downpour, a solid, driving sheet of water that turned the hard-packed ground into a slick, treacherous mud. A cry went up from one of the hands. A group of newborn calves, too weak to keep up with their mothers, had taken shelter in a low, grassy hollow. Now, that hollow was rapidly becoming a small lake. The calves were struggling in the rising, muddy water, their plaintive cries barely audible over the roar of the storm. There was no time to think. Cole was already running. Ara right behind him, the other hands following. They waded into the churning, knee-deep water, the mud sucking at their boots. The calves, terrified, tried to scatter. It was chaotic, desperate work. Cole, strong as an ox, wrestled a calf out of the mud and half carried, half dragged it to higher ground. Ara, smaller but quicker, managed to get behind another, herding it out of the deepest water. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized by the shared, urgent purpose. They were soaked to the skin, covered in mud, their faces grim with concentration. At one point, Ara slipped, falling to her knees in the cold water. Before she could even register the shock, Cole's hand was there, strong and steady, pulling her to her feet. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, a look of shared struggle and mutual reliance passing between them. Finally, the last calf was safe. They stood in the pouring rain, exhausted, shivering, and victorious. The small herd of rescued animals huddled together on the hillside. They trudged back to the house, leaving a trail of muddy water on the kitchen floor. The other hands went to the bunkhouse to get dry. But Ara and Cole stood in the kitchen, the adrenaline slowly leaving them, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and hoarse. He was looking at her, not at a worker, but at a woman, his partner in the small, fierce battle they had just won. She just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently brushed a strand of mud-caked hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, but warm. It sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. He lowered his hand to hers, their fingers lacing together, calloused and muddy. It was an anchor in the storm, a moment of profound connection that went beyond words. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was short, chaste, a simple meeting of lips, but it was filled with all the unspoken things that had grown between them: respect, gratitude, a shared loneliness. It was a taste of salt and rain, and the promise of something new. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. A few honest words were whispered in the near darkness, simple truths from weary hearts. Then he led her from the kitchen. The door to her small room closed quietly, and a few moments later, the light from her lamp went out. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The rain had stopped, and the sun was shining, glinting off a landscape that was, for the first time in months, free of dust. Cole rode into town for supplies, his clothes still bearing the faint stains of the previous night's mud. He ran into Marisol at the general store. She took one look at his shirt, and a slow, knowing grin spread across her face. "That is a special kind of mud you have there." "Cole," she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "The kind from your ranch. It seems to know how to smile." Cole felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. He scratched the back of his head, a gesture of uncharacteristic awkwardness. "I suppose it must have slipped and fell," he muttered, and quickly changed the subject. Back at the ranch, a new, unspoken understanding settled between Ara and Cole. But for Ara, her self-respect demanded more than unspoken understandings. That evening, she approached him with her labor journal. "Cole," she began, her voice steady, "I am not the woman who was brought here on that wagon. I am a partner in this ranch's survival. I want that to be official. I want a proper agreement, my wages, and a share of the profits if we can save the calf herd." He did not hesitate. He looked at her, his expression full of a deep and abiding respect. "You are right," he said. He took the journal from her, turned to a clean page, and began to write out the terms, his hand sure and steady. He was not just giving her a job, he was acknowledging her value. Their bond deepened, built not just on shared work, but on shared vulnerabilities. Another rainy night, as they sat listening to the gentle drumming on the tin roof, Cole began to speak of his late wife, Sarah. "She loved this sound," he said softly, his gaze distant. "She said it was the sound of the earth drinking." He spoke of her love for books, of her laugh, of the way she had filled the sparse house with a warmth he had never been able to replicate. Ara listened, her heart open. There was no jealousy, no sense of being compared to a ghost. There was only a profound empathy for the man beside her and the loss he had endured. When he fell silent, she reached out and gently placed her hand over the faint scar on his chest, the lingering reminder of his time in the cavalry. It was a gesture of comfort, of acceptance of all that he was, past and present. The small community of the ranch had embraced Ara fully now. Eli, the young boy she had saved from the charging steer, had composed a short, simple poem. He had titled it, "The Girl Who Called the Rain." One of the hands wrote it out in careful letters on a piece of smooth wood and hung it in the barn. Everyone who passed it by would read it and smile. Ara had become a part of their folklore, a symbol of their resilience. This new confidence followed her into town, one afternoon in the saloon, where she had gone with Cole to settle a bill. A man, a known associate of McCready's, tried to bait her. "Heard you found some water out at the Hartman place," the man said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "What is your secret? Some kind of woman's magic?" The implication was clear, a crude reference to the old, ugly rumors. The old Ara would have shrunk from the confrontation, but she was not the old Ara. She turned to face the man, her expression calm, her voice clear and carrying. "The land does not ask about a person's womb," she said, her words cutting through the sudden silence of the room. "It only asks about their hands." The man was left speechless. A low murmur of approval went through the saloon. Ara had not only defended herself, she had spoken a fundamental truth of their hardscrabble lives. But their enemies were not so easily defeated. One night, a strange orange glow flickered against the dark sky. A cry of fire shattered the peace of the ranch. One of the hay barns was ablaze, the dry fodder catching with terrifying speed. By the time they managed to put it out, a significant portion of their winter feed for the cattle was gone. No one was hurt, but it was a calculated act of destruction. A warning. The risk for the coming winter had just grown tenfold. The pressure was immense. The foreclosure date loomed. The fire was a devastating blow. It seemed as if they were trapped, with no way out. But a sliver of hope arrived in the form of Sheriff Maeve O'Rourke. She had taken their case to the circuit judge, presenting Jonas's plaster cast of the boot print and Ara's petition. The judge, a man with an eye for legal detail, agreed that there was enough evidence to warrant a full investigation of McCready's dam. He issued a temporary injunction, a legal order that put a pause on the bank's foreclosure until the water rights issue could be settled in court. It was a reprieve, not a victory, but it was enough. That night, Cole and Ara stood looking out at the charred remains of the barn, the smell of smoke still hanging in the air. Cole let out a long, weary sigh. "If we lose this, Ara," he said, his voice heavy, "I will sell the horse herd. It might be enough to hold on to the land itself." Ara looked at his tired, determined profile, and her own resolve hardened into a certainty as solid as the mountains around them. "If we lose," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering, "then I will go with you, but we have not lost yet." The judge's injunction was a shield, but a temporary one. It bought them time, a commodity more precious than gold in dust water. But with that time came a new and uglier attack, one that fought not with dams and fires, but with ink and lies. A new edition of the Dustwater Chronicle, a flimsy, single-sheet newspaper that thrived on gossip and scandal, was tacked to the front of the saloon. The headline, printed in large, uneven letters, was a masterpiece of malicious cruelty. Her family bartered her as Barren, yet a rancher made her pregnant in 3 days and loved her truly. The words were a physical blow. They took every private wound, every public humiliation, every fragile hope, and twisted them into a grotesque spectacle for public consumption. It was a lie wrapped in a sliver of truth, designed to inflict the maximum possible damage. It reduced Ara's struggle to a crude joke and Cole's quiet decency to a sordid transaction. They saw it when they rode into town for supplies. A group of children were pointing at it, whispering and giggling. The merchant in the general store smirked as they walked in. The women of the town, who had just begun to greet Ara with cautious smiles after the cornbread competition, now looked away, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and morbid curiosity. Cole's face became a mask of cold, hard fury. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of the pistol he wore on his hip, a habit from his cavalry days. Ara put a restraining hand on his arm. Her own face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, white line, but her eyes were clear and steady. There was no fear in them, only a cold, burning anger. She did not turn away. She did not hide. She walked directly to the front of the saloon, the whispers and stares following her like a cloud of flies. She stood before the newspaper for a long moment, reading the hateful words again. Then, with a deliberate, almost ceremonial grace, she reached up and tore the sheet from the wall. The crowd that had gathered let out a collective gasp, expecting a storm of tears or a retreat into shame. Ara did neither. She tore the newspaper neatly in half, straight down the middle. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she took the two halves, overlapped them so the headline was still crudely visible, and used the same nail to tack the ruined page back onto the wall. She turned to face the silent, watching town. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried with an undeniable authority. "We do not run from words," she said, her gaze sweeping over their faces. "We are about to prove them liars." She walked back to Cole, her head held high. He looked at her, a profound admiration in his eyes that overshadowed his anger. He helped her onto the wagon, and they rode out of town without another word. That evening, the silence on the ranch was heavy. Cole finally broke it as they stood by the corral, watching the horses. "I could find the man who wrote that," he said, his voice a low growl. "And what Ara asked, turning to him, beating him will not unprint the words. It will only prove we are ruled by anger." She looked out at the parched land, the new trough stretching toward the north pasture. "You said it yourself. Cole, the truth needs land, water, and time. Let us tend to those three things." He nodded, the anger in his shoulders slowly unknotting. She was right. Their fight was not in the saloon, it was in the courthouse. And on this land, their first breakthrough came 2 days later. Sheriff Maeve O'Rourke rode out to the ranch, her face lit with a grim satisfaction. She was holding the plaster cast Jonas had made of the boot print. "I got a warrant to search the bunkhouse at the McCready place," she announced. "Found a pair of boots under a cot. The heel is worn in the exact same pattern. It is a perfect match." It was the piece of hard evidence they needed, the direct link between McCready's men and the stampede. "With this," Maeve said, holding up the cast, "the judge gave me what we really need, a warrant to inspect that dam." They rode out the next morning, a small party of Justice Maeve in her official capacity, Cole as the plaintiff, and Ara, who insisted on coming as a witness. The dam was an ugly scar on the land, a mound of raw, red earth and hastily piled rock that held back a stagnant, muddy pool of what should have been their creek. Ara surveyed the construction, her farmer's eye noting the shoddy workmanship. "They built it well," she observed, her tone laced with a dry irony. Maeve, standing beside her, snorted, so well that it is against the law, while Maeve documented the illegal structure. Ara felt a wave of dizziness, the result of weeks of overwork and stress, the long ride, coupled with the intense emotional strain of the past few days, had taken its toll. Cole insisted she see a doctor when they returned to town. The only one available was Dr. Townley. The visit was tense. Ara sat on the examination table in the small, sterile room, the same room where she had been symbolically condemned years ago. Dr. Townley was brisk and professional, his manner betraying a deep discomfort. He listened to her heart, checked her breathing, and felt her pulse. He could not find anything wrong. In fact, for a woman who had been through so much, she was remarkably healthy. "You are exhausted," he said, his eyes refusing to meet hers. "You need rest and proper nutrition." He scribbled a note on a piece of paper. He wanted to say more, to repeat his old, confident diagnosis. But he could not. He was a man of science, and the evidence before him, the steady pulse beneath his fingers, the clear eyes that met his gaze without flinching, contradicted the label he had so easily applied. The word Barren remained unspoken, a ghost in the room that had lost its power to haunt. The cracks in their opposition were beginning to show elsewhere. A few days after the dam inspection, one of Pike McCready's younger ranch hands was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. Facing a night in Maeve's jail cell and terrified of being implicated in the stampede and the illegal dam, the young man broke down. He told Maeve everything. He admitted to being part of the group that cut the fences. And then he gave them the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. The money to build the dam, he confessed, had not come from McCready alone. Banker Reed had been a silent partner, funding the operation in exchange for a share of the Hartman Ranch after the foreclosure. The conspiracy was finally laid bare. The news spread through Dustwater not with the speed of a malicious rumor, but with the slow, satisfying weight of truth. The tide of public opinion, which had been so easily swayed by the Chronicle's lies, began to turn. The townspeople, who lived under the thumb of Reed's financial power and McCready's bullying, now had heroes to root for. Marisol, in her small eatery, became the public face of this shift. The day Maeve's official report was filed, Marisol put a new sign in her window, hand-painted in bright, cheerful letters, "Free Justice Cornbread." The town took her up on the offer. The eatery was filled with laughter and conversation. When Ara and Cole walked in, a spontaneous cheer went up. People were no longer whispering behind her back. They were clapping him on the shoulder and offering her a chair. The shame had lifted. That night, the rain returned. A soft, steady drumming on the roof of the ranch house. Cole and Ara sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the darkness. The air was cool and clean, washed free of dust and lies. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, the shared quiet, a deeper form of communication than words. "I love you," Cole said, his voice so low it was almost part of the sound of the rain. He was not looking at her, but out at the dark, thirsty land. "I love you not for anything anyone demands, or for any purpose you might serve. I love you because you are Ara. That is all. That is enough." Tears welled in Ara's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of a profound, soul-deep release. He had seen her, truly seen her, past the labels and the rumors, past the word that had tried to define her. He had seen the woman who fought for water, who stood up to bullies, who calmed a stampede, and he loved her. That was the truth. The rest was just noise. But their enemies, now exposed and cornered, were not content to fade away. Reed, facing financial ruin and public disgrace, and McCready, facing a long prison sentence, were desperate men, and desperate men are dangerous. In the back room of the saloon, under the dim light of a single lantern, they made one last, desperate plan. The judge's injunction was based on the dam. The criminal charges were based on the stampede. If the Hartman Ranch, the source of all their troubles, were to simply disappear, consumed in a fire that could be blamed on a stray lightning strike from the recent storms, their problems might just vanish with it. The night was unnervingly still. The rain had passed, leaving the air heavy and cool, pregnant with the smell of damp earth. A sliver of moon offered little light, and the stars seemed distant and cold. Ara was checking on a mare in the barn, her hand resting on the horse's warm flank, when she saw it, a faint, unnatural flicker of orange against the dark silhouette of the remaining hay barn. It was not the gentle glow of a lantern, it was hungry. Before a cry could even form in her throat, the flicker blossomed into a hungry roar. A sheet of flame shot up the side of the barn, illuminating the ranch in a terrifying, dancing light. Fire! The word was torn from her, a raw shout against the sudden crackle of burning timber. Men spilled from the bunkhouse, their faces pale and shocked in the firelight. Cole was already out of the main house, pulling on his boots, his expression a mask of grim disbelief. But as Ara ran toward the blaze, a scent hit her that stopped her cold. It was not just wood smoke, it was the sharp, greasy smell of kerosene. This was not an accident. It was not a stray spark or a lightning strike. It was a deliberate act of destruction. At that moment, the wind, which had been still, chose its side. It shifted, gusting from the north, pushing the flames and a shower of burning embers not toward the open fields, but directly at the main horse barn and the house. Their sanctuary and their most valuable assets were now in the path of the inferno. Just as chaos was about to take hold, the thunder of hooves announced a new arrival. Sheriff Maeve O'Rourke galloped into the ranch yard, her horse lathered in sweat. She had been riding out to warn them, a gut feeling telling her that cornered men like Reed and McCready would not go down quietly. She arrived not as a harbinger of doom, but as an instrument of the law at the very moment it was needed most. It was McCready, Cole said, his voice a low growl of certainty as he saw the direction of the tracks leading away from the fire. He and his men. A split-second decision was made, an unspoken agreement between two people who understood the harsh calculus of Western justice. "Go," Maeve said to Cole, her hand already on her pistol. "I am with you. We can't let them get away." Cole looked at Ara. In his eyes, she saw his rage, his fear, and a desperate plea for her to be safe. But she also saw his trust. He knew, without having to ask, that she would not run. She would fight. "Go," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "We will save the barn." As Cole and Maeve disappeared into the darkness, a strange calm settled over Ara. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, clear purpose. She turned to the handful of terrified ranch hands. This was her home now, and she would not let it burn. "Silas, you and Jacob, get the pump going at the well. Form a bucket line," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority none of them had heard from her before. "Eli, get into the barn and keep the horses calm. Talk to them, keep them from panicking and bolting. We save the horse barn first. Let the hay burn." The men, startled by her sudden command, did not hesitate. Her calm was contagious. They moved with a desperate energy, their fear channeled into action. Ara grabbed a wet burlap sack and ran toward the side of the horse barn, beating at the embers that had begun to smolder on the dry wood. The heat was a physical blow, searing her skin and scorching her lungs. The air was thick with smoke that stung her eyes and made her choke. But she did not stop. She was a whirlwind of motion. Her focus narrowed to the single, all-important task of survival. Meanwhile, Cole and Maeve rode hard, their horses stretching out, eating up the dark terrain. The tracks were easy to follow in the faint moonlight. They led away from the ranch and toward the narrow, rocky canyons that cut through the hills. It was a perfect place for an ambush, but McCready was not thinking of an ambush. He was thinking only of escape. They cornered him in a narrow ravine, a dead end with walls of sheer rock on three sides. McCready and one of his men reined in their horses, their faces illuminated in the pale light, streaked with soot and panic. "It is over, McCready," Cole said, his voice echoing in the confined space. He did not draw his weapon. His hands rested on his saddle horn, but his entire being radiated a deadly stillness. McCready laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Over Hartman. You still do not get it. This is how the West is won. By burning out the weak and building on their ashes. That is the law of this land." "That is the law of the predator," Cole shot back, his voice cutting like a whip. "I live by a different one. I live by keeping my word to the people who depend on me, not by preying on them." McCready's hand started to move toward his gun, but before he could draw, a single, deafening shot cracked through the canyon. It was not from Cole. Maeve, positioned on a ledge above them, had fired a warning shot into the rock wall just above McCready's head. Rock chips sprayed into the air. "Drop it. Pike," she commanded, her voice clear and cold as iron. "You are under arrest for arson and attempted murder." McCready's man, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, threw his gun down and his hands up. McCready hesitated for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Then, with a curse, he slowly, reluctantly, raised his hands. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the bitter certainty of defeat. Back in Dustwater, news of the fire had spread. The glow in the sky was visible for miles. As the townspeople began to gather in the street, their faces etched with fear and excitement, Banker Reed saw his world crumbling. He knew McCready would be caught. He knew the confession of the young ranch hand would have reached the sheriff by now. He was a ruined man. In a final, desperate act of self-preservation, he made a move born of pure panic. He saw young Eli, who had been sent to town earlier for supplies, standing by the public watering trough, his face wide with fear as he watched the commotion. Reed lunged, grabbing the boy, pulling him close and pressing the cold barrel of a small derringer to his temple. "Nobody move," he shrieked, his voice high and thin with terror. "I will not be taken. Get me a horse." The crowd gasped. Falling back, the boy, Eli, was frozen with fear, tears streaming down his face. Just then, a wagon came rattling into town from the direction of the Hartman Ranch. It was Ara. She was covered in soot, her hair singed, her face grimy, but her eyes were clear and bright with a fierce intensity. She took in the scene in an instant, the terrified boy, the frantic banker, the helpless crowd. She slid from the wagon seat and began to walk toward them, her movement slow and deliberate. She held up a hand to the stunned townspeople. "Stay back," she said, her voice calm and steady. She stopped about 20 feet from Reed. "Let him go, Mr. Reed," she said, her tone reasonable, as if they were discussing a loan. "Stay back," he screamed, his hand trembling. "There is no need for this," Ara continued, her voice never rising. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the original promissory note, the one her father had signed. "This is what this is all about. Is it not this piece of paper?" Reed stared at the document, his eyes wide and crazed. It was the source of his greed, the instrument of his crime. "Let the boy go, and we can talk about this agreement," Ara said, her voice a soothing balm on a raw nerve. "In fact, why do you not read it? Read it aloud, so everyone can hear the terms of the deal you made." It was a brilliant move. She was appealing to his vanity, his belief in the power of his own contracts, mesmerized, his mind unhinged by panic. Reed did as she asked, his eyes still on the crowd. He began to read the damning words, his voice shaking, for the sum of, secured by the service of his daughter, Ara Langley. As he read, the townspeople listened, their expressions turning from fear to outrage. They were hearing, in the banker's own voice, the cold, hard proof of his depravity. He had not just tried to steal a man's ranch. He had participated in the buying and selling of a human being. In that moment of distraction, as all eyes were on Reed, a figure moved silently from the side of the blacksmith's shop. It was Maeve. She had returned with McCready in tow, leaving him trussed and under guard. She moved with the swift, silent grace of a predator. Before Reed could even register her presence, her hand shot out. Grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply, the derringer clattered to the ground. In the same motion, she shoved Reed away and pulled Eli into her protective embrace. The spell was broken. Reed was just a small, pathetic man, stripped of his power, surrounded by the angry faces of the people he had tried to control. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony of McCready's captured man, Jonas's plaster cast, the inspection of the illegal dam, and now the charge of arson and kidnapping. McCready and Reed were found guilty on all counts. The judge, his face a mask of stern disapproval, sentenced them to a long term in the territorial prison. His final act was to issue an order for the immediate dismantling of the dam. A few days later, Ara stood in the main street of Dustwater. A team of men had just returned from the creek, their work done. The water was flowing freely to the Hartman Ranch once more. She looked at the front of the saloon, where a new edition of the Dustwater Chronicle was posted. The headline was different this time. "Barren, maybe the Barren is the law, not the girl." Ara read the words, and a slow smile spread across her face. It was not a smile of triumph or of vindication. It was a smile of peace. The word had no more power over her. It was just ink on paper. She was the one who had made the water flow. That evening, she and Cole stood on the porch of the ranch house. watching the sunset paint the sky in the shades of orange and purple. The charred skeleton of the hay barn was a grim reminder of their ordeal, but the main barn and the house stood strong. The sound of the restored creek was a gentle, constant murmur in the background, a song of life returning. Cole turned to her, his face serious in the fading light. "You are free." "Ara," he said, his voice quiet. "As free as you were that first day, the debt is paid. Your name is cleared. You can go anywhere you want." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "Or you can stay. You can put your name on the deed, right next to mine." It was not a flowery proposal. It was a statement of partnership, an offer of a shared future built on a foundation of mutual respect and hard-won survival. Ara looked at the land, her land, a place she had fought for and bled for. She looked at this quiet, honorable man who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself. "I will stay," she said, her voice filled with a new and unshakable certainty. "But I want the water rights registered in my name alone, so that if anyone ever asks me what my value is, I can answer them with a deed to the land, not with an excuse about my womb." With the dam gone, the creek returned. It was not a flood, but a steady, faithful flow, gurgling over the stones that had been dry for so long. It was the sound of the ranch's heart starting to beat again. Life followed the water. Within weeks, a faint green blush appeared on the pastures nearest the creek, a stark contrast to the parched brown of the surrounding land. The cattle, which had grown thin and listless, began to fill out, their coats regaining their healthy sheen. The whole atmosphere of the ranch lifted, as if a great weight had been removed from the very air they breathed. Ara, however, was not content to simply rely on the restored creek. She had seen how quickly their fortunes could change, how vulnerable they were to the whims of men and the sky. One afternoon, she walked with Cole along the newly green banks, her gaze analytical. "This grass is a blessing," she said, stooping to run a blade of it through her fingers, "but it depends entirely on this one stream. When the dry season comes again, we will be in the same position." Cole nodded, his eyes following hers. "It is the way it has always been." "It does not have to be," she countered. She pointed to a fallow field that had been too far from the creek to water. "That field gets the most sun. The soil is deep. If we plow it and plant sorghum, it will grow. Sorghum does not need much water once it takes root. It is good feed for the cattle, and we can store it for the winter. If we rotate the fields, letting the pastures rest while we grow feed, the land will stay healthy, and we will not be so dependent on the rain or the creek." He listened, not with the skepticism of a man set in his ways, but with the focused attention of a partner. He saw the logic in her plan, the deep, practical wisdom born of a lifetime spent working the soil. It was another piece of her value, another way she was weaving her own strength into the fabric of the ranch. The next day, the sound of a plow breaking new ground echoed through the valley. The healing of the land was mirrored by a healing in the town. The story of the fire, of Reed's desperate act, and of Ara's calm courage had stripped away the last vestiges of the old rumors. She was no longer a subject of gossip. She was a local hero. The most surprising manifestation of this change came from the church. The Sunday after the trial, the priest, a man whose sermons had once inadvertently wounded her, stood before his congregation with a look of profound humility on his face. He did not speak of Eve or of a woman's duty. He spoke of the sin of bearing false witness, of the poison of gossip, and of the community's failure to see the value of a person beyond the narrow confines of their expectations. He spoke of the courage and resilience he had witnessed, and he publicly asked for forgiveness for any words that had caused pain. Then he did something unprecedented. He invited Ara Langley to come forward. A quiet murmur went through the church. Ara, who had been sitting in the back pew with Cole, felt a moment of panic. All eyes were on her. Cole gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. She took a deep breath, stood, and walked to the front of the small, silent church. She did not stand at the pulpit. She stood on the floor, on the same level as everyone else. She looked out at the faces of the townspeople, faces that had once been a source of pain and were now filled with a quiet, expectant respect. Her speech was not long. It was not angry or boastful. It was simple, and it was true. Value, she said, her voice clear and steady, is not found in speculation. That was all. She nodded to the priest and walked back to her seat. A profound silence held the room for a beat, and then a single person began to clap. Soon, the entire church was filled with the sound of heartfelt applause. It was not for a hero, it was for a neighbor. The journey toward restitution continued the following week. Dr. Townley's buggy pulled into the ranch yard. He did not come on a medical call. He had come to see Ara. He found her by the new troughs, inspecting a joint for leaks. He stood awkwardly for a moment, his hat in his hands. "Miss Langley," he began, his professional bluster gone, replaced by a stilted sincerity. "I have come to offer an apology." He looked down at his hat, then back at her. "My diagnosis, all those years ago, it was based on incomplete knowledge. It was a careless and presumptive label to place upon a person. I have since read new medical journals, attended a lecture. I was wrong. My profession demands certainty, and in your case, I provided a judgment instead. I have already amended my records, and I will be more cautious in the future." Ara listened, her expression unreadable. This was the man whose single word had set the course of her life, had led to her being sold, to her journey west, to this very spot. She could have raged at him, could have listed all the pain his carelessness had caused. Instead, she saw a man humbled by his own fallibility. "Thank you, doctor," she said simply. "That is all I ever wanted. Not for the record to be different, but for it to be true." The final seal was placed on her new life at the county courthouse. The judge, with a flourish of his pen, officially nullified the promissory note, declaring it an illegal and immoral contract. Then, he reviewed the paperwork Cole had filed. He read the names aloud, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet courtroom. "The deed for the Hartman Ranch is hereby amended to include the name of Ara Hartman Langley. The primary water rights to the creek, as per the attached survey, are registered solely in her name." It was done. She was no longer a bartered woman. She was a landowner. Ara Hartman Langley. The name felt solid and real, a name to build a life on. A letter from her father was waiting for her when she returned. The handwriting was shaky. This one was not a public justification, but a private plea. It was short, filled with the simple, painful words of a man who knew he had failed his child. "I'm sorry. Ara, I was a fool and a coward. I pray you can forgive me." A week later, Ara went to the bank. She did not withdraw her savings. She arranged for a small bank draft to be sent to her father's address, enough to help with the planting. With it, she sent a small, heavy sack of the hardy sorghum seed they had bought for the ranch. There was no letter enclosed. The seeds, and the money she had earned with her own 2 hands, said everything that needed to be said. The town, for its part, found its own way to celebrate her victory. One afternoon, Marisol unveiled a new sign, painted in her signature bright colors, and hung it proudly in the window of her eatery. "Miss Ara's cornbread proof a Barren woman can make dough rise." The first person to read it let out a bark of laughter. Soon, a small crowd had gathered, and the sound of shared, good-natured humor filled the street. The ugliest word in Ara's life had been transformed, through the alchemy of friendship and wit, into a joke. It had lost its sting forever. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, one of rebuilding and quiet hope. Cole, with the help of the hands, began to construct a new barn on the foundation of the one that had burned. When the main crossbeam was raised, Ara saw that he had taken the time to carve a single word deep into the wood. Home. It was not a house or a piece of land. It was a feeling, a commitment, a place of belonging. That evening, Ara went to her room. She took out the old ledger, the one where she had first started keeping her journal of labor. She carried it into the main room of the house, without a word. She stood on a chair and hung it from a nail on the wall, next to the fireplace. It was her own declaration, a testament to the work and dignity that had brought her here. Her first contract, written by her own hand. It was a Medal of Honor. The Dustwater Chronicle, in a stunning display of newfound conscience, printed a small column on its back page, formally retracting the slanderous headline and offering a brief apology for its journalistic excess. Ara read it once, then used the paper to light the evening fire. She did not need their retraction. She was busy living the truth. One clear, cool night, she and Cole sat on the porch, their shoulders touching, watching the full moon rise over the valley. The world was peaceful, bathed in a soft, silvery light. "Eli is learning to read," Cole said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He practices on the feed sacks." "He is a smart boy," Ara said. "All the children who work on these ranches are. They just do not have a school to go to." An idea took shape between them, a shared vision for the future. "We could start one," Cole said, turning the idea over in his mind. "In the old bunkhouse, just for an hour or two in the evenings. Teach them their letters, their numbers." "I would like that," Ara said, a warmth spreading through her chest. They were not just building a ranch, they were building a community. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling a profound sense of peace, for the first time since she was a young girl. She felt completely at home in her own body. The constant, low-grade fatigue that had been her companion for years was gone, replaced by a deep, steady strength. She felt healthy, whole. The question of children, the one that had defined her entire adult life, seemed to recede, becoming small and unimportant. If a child came, it would be a joy. If it did not, her life was already full. Her happiness was not a crop to be harvested from her womb. It was a well she had dug with her own 2 hands, and its water was deep and cool and entirely her own. The months that followed were a time of quiet, steady work. The sorghum Ara had planted grew tall and green under the summer sun, its heavy heads promising a winter of security. The ranch settled into a rhythm of healing. The new barn rose from the ashes of the old, its fresh pine scent a clean fragrance of renewal. Cole and Ara worked as partners, their days filled with shared labor and their evenings with a comfortable, easy silence. The scars on the land were fading, and so were the scars on their hearts. Ara had never felt stronger. The constant, gnawing fatigue that had been a shadow for most of her adult life had vanished, replaced by a vibrant energy that hummed just beneath her skin. One afternoon, however, after a long day of helping with the sorghum harvest, she felt a familiar wave of lightheadedness. Cole, seeing her sway, insisted she ride into town for a checkup with Dr. Townley. The visit was nothing like their previous encounters. The small examination room no longer felt like a place of judgment. Dr. Townley was meticulously professional, his earlier condescension replaced by a respectful, almost cautious, demeanor. He listened to her heart and lungs, took her pulse, and asked a series of clinical questions. Ara answered them calmly, feeling a detached sense of amusement at the reversal of their roles. She was no longer a desperate girl seeking answers. She was a healthy woman indulging her husband's concern. When he was finished, the doctor sat back, a perplexed look on his face. He cleared his throat. "Well, Mrs. Hartman Langley," he said, the new name sounding slightly awkward on his tongue. "Whatever you are doing out at that ranch, it certainly agrees with you. Your health is, for lack of a better word, perfect. You are a remarkably strong woman." He paused, looking at his notes as if they might hold a secret. He did not say the word she expected, the word that had once defined her. He offered no diagnosis, no speculation. He simply gave her a piece of advice. I recommend you continue as you are, but listen to your body. Conserve your strength. It is a valuable commodity. Ara left the clinic with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The doctor's pronouncement was not a miracle. It was a confirmation of what she already knew. She was whole. The old lies, however, had a way of lingering like ghosts. A few days later, in the general store, a rancher from a neighboring spread, a man known more for his loud mouth than his good sense, saw her and grinned. Well, if it ain't the woman from the newspaper, he boomed, winking at the storekeeper, the one who performed the 3-day miracle Hartman ought to sell tickets. A year ago, the words would have flayed her alive. Now, Ara simply turned, a calm, easy smile on her face. The other customers fell silent, waiting for the confrontation. 3 days, Ara said, her voice pleasant and carrying easily through the quiet store, is just about how long it takes for a good lie to grow roots. But the thing about roots like that is, they pull up easy. The rancher's grin faltered. He was left standing in a sudden, thick silence, unsure of what to do in the face of a woman who refused to be shamed. Ara paid for her things and left, the quiet chuckles of the other customers following her out the door. The true emotional peak of her journey, the moment that finally and completely healed her, came not in a doctor's office or a general store, but on her own front porch. Cole had been waiting for the official, notarized copy of the new deed to come back from the county seat. It arrived on the afternoon mail coach that evening, as they sat watching the sunset. He brought it out. It was a heavy, important-looking document, filled with the dense, looping script of the law. He did not make a speech. He simply handed it to her. She took it, her hands tracing the embossed seal. She read the words that legally bound her to this piece of land, this life. And then she saw the part he had filled in himself, next to his own printed name, as a co-owner. Her name, Ara Hartman Langley. His handwriting, usually so strong and steady, was shaky, the letters thick with an emotion he could never speak aloud. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. They were hot and cleansing. Cole reached out, thinking she was sad, but she shook her head, unable to speak. He did not understand, not completely. These were not tears for a child that might or might not be. They were not tears of gratitude for his love. They were tears for the woman whose name was finally, legally, irrevocably written down as a person of substance, a holder of deeds, a master of her own fate. This piece of paper was the child born of their struggle, a testament to her worth that no one could ever question or take away. Their life took on a new, richer texture. The small school in the old barn became the heart of the ranch community. On a cool autumn evening, Ara and Cole stood in the doorway, listening. The room was filled with the soft glow of lanterns and the hesitant voices of children sounding out their letters. Eli, his face alight with pride, stood before the small group and read from the wooden plaque that hung on the wall. His voice was still a boy's, but it was clear and confident. The girl who called the rain, he read, his eyes finding Ara's in the doorway. He smiled, a wide, gap-toothed grin of pure accomplishment. Ara's heart felt so full it might burst. This was a harvest of a different kind, one that would feed the future. Their love was a quiet thing, expressed not in grand pronouncements but in small, daily acts of partnership. One night, as they lay in the quiet darkness of their room, the question that had once been the center of her universe surfaced, not as a source of pain, but as a simple fact of their shared life. "If a child comes, we will love it," Ara whispered into the darkness. "And if one does not, we are still a home." She felt Cole's arm tighten around her. "A home," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear, "is the place where your name is written." They found a way to honor the past without letting it cast a shadow over their present. on the anniversary of his first wife, Sarah's death. Cole lit a single, tall candle and placed it on the mantelpiece. He stood before it for a long time, his face unreadable in the flickering light. Ara did not intrude on his grief. She waited until he had moved away. Then she went outside and returned with a single, hardy wildflower she had picked from the banks of the creek. She placed the small, bright flower next to the base of the candle. It was a gesture of respect, of peace, an acknowledgement of the woman whose memory was a part of the man she loved. Their days were not without their small annoyances. A letter arrived from Maeve, informing them that Reed, from his prison cell, had hired a lawyer to file a frivolous lawsuit against the town and the ranch for slander. Maeve was unconcerned. "He has no case," she wrote. "The judge is more likely to charge him with wasting the court's time. Do not give it a second thought. It is just the last gasp of a dying snake." It was a minor irritation, a reminder that the world outside their valley still turned. But it had no power to touch the peace they had built. One lazy afternoon, they walked down to the creek, the heart of their ranch. They sat on the bank, the water gurgling over the smooth stones, a constant, soothing music. Marisol had ridden out for a visit, and she was in a heated, comical debate with one of the older hands about the best way to teach arithmetic in their new school. "You cannot fill a child's head with abstract numbers," she declared, gesturing with a half-eaten apple. "You must be practical, you teach them. 1 cow plus 1 cow is 2 cows. 10 cows means a good sale. 20 cows means you can afford a new roof. That is mathematics for living." Ara and Cole listened, smiling. This was their life now, a life filled with honest work, good friends, and the simple, profound joy of a home. Ara leaned back, resting her head against Cole's shoulder. She looked at their reflection in the clear, moving water. She did not see a man and a woman. She saw 2 hats side by side, their brims nearly touching. A simple, perfect image of partnership against the backdrop of a healing land. She was no longer controlled or defined by a single, cruel word. She knew who she was. She was a water finder, a deed holder, a wife. She was home. The first harvest of the sorghum was a quiet triumph. The tall green stalks stood thick in the field, their heavy heads nodding in the autumn breeze. It was more than just cattle feed. It was a symbol of Ara's foresight, a tangible result of her refusal to bow to fate. The cattle, fat and healthy on the restored pasture and the new grain, brought a good price at market. It was enough. Enough to walk into Banker Reed's old office, now run by a nervous young man from the county seat, and pay off the final installment of the Hartman Ranch loan. The pen felt heavy in Cole's hand as he signed the last paper. The ink a final, definitive stroke that severed the last tie to the man who had tried to ruin them. They did not celebrate with a party. Instead, they took a portion of the profits and established a small fund, managed by Marisol and Jonas, for the purpose of repairing and maintaining the public well and dust water. It was a gift to the town that had, in the end, chosen to stand with them. It was their way of ensuring that no one else would be so desperate for water that they would be forced to make a deal with a devil like Pike McCready. The final chapter of that dark story closed a few weeks later. A letter from Sheriff Maeve O'Rourke, now promoted to chief deputy for the entire county, informed them that the appeals court had upheld the convictions of both McCready and Reed. Their desperate last-minute legal maneuvers had failed. Justice, once set in motion, had run its course. Maeve's letter also mentioned that, inspired by the events at the Hartman Ranch, the county commissioners had worked with her to draft a new set of clear and fair regulations regarding public water rights. Dust water, born of thirst and conflict, was now a place with laws to protect its most precious resource. The poison had been drawn out, and the wound was beginning to heal. The town's transformation continued. The church, seeking to build on its new foundation of humility, organized a series of evening talks on community values. One evening, the topic was human worth and the weight of words. After the priest spoke, he once again invited Ara to the front. This time, it was not for a speech. He told the assembled women of the town that Mrs. Hartman Langley, with the support of the church council, would be starting a literacy class, held 2 evenings a week, for any woman who wished to learn to read and write. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Ara found herself surrounded by women, young and old, their faces alight with a hope for a tool that would grant them a new measure of independence. She was no longer just a landowner. She was becoming a pillar of the community she had helped to save. One afternoon, a copy of the Dustwater Chronicle, now under new and more sober management, found its way out to the ranch. Ara sat on the porch swing, the gentle creak, a familiar, comforting rhythm, and unfolded the single sheet. The lead story was about the new water regulations, but it was the headline that caught her eye. A simple, declarative statement that spoke of a profound change. Dust water grows where kindness flows. She read the words, and a deep, quiet satisfaction settled in her heart. She folded the paper neatly and set it aside. There was no need to tear this one down, no need to refute it. The town was finally telling the right story. It was finally telling the truth. That night, a chill in the air hinted at the coming winter. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow across the main room. Ara and Cole sat on a thick rug before it, leaning against each other, the comfortable silence between them more intimate than any conversation. The house was quiet, the ranch hands asleep in the bunkhouse. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind outside. Cole's arm was wrapped around her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a gesture of simple, solid possession that felt like safety. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. They did not speak of the past, of the fire, or the fear. They whispered of the future, of the best way to expand the school, of a new breed of cattle that might be better suited to the dry climate, of the new roof the barn still needed. Their words were small, practical, the building blocks of a shared life. The warmth of the fire was nothing compared to the warmth that radiated from their quiet connection, the profound and unshakable certainty of home. Above them, on the great central beam of the house, were the symbols of their journey. In the center was the word Cole had carved, home. To one side of it, hanging from a leather thong, was the small, worn ledger where Ara had first begun to tally her labor, her first declaration of self-worth. On the other side, carefully preserved in a simple wooden frame Jonas had made, was the official deed to the ranch, with both their names written upon it. They were not just documents, they were the children of their union, born not of flesh, but of labor, justice, and a love that had been forged in the crucible of adversity. As the fire burned low, their conversation turned, as it often did, to the children who came to their small school. They spoke of Eli's quick mind, of a young girl's artistic talent, and of a small, quiet boy, an orphan who lived with the blacksmith, whose eyes held a deep and lonely sadness. "He is a good boy," Cole said, his voice a low rumble. "Just needs a place to feel he belongs." Ara turned her head, looking up at her husband in the firelight. "We have a place," she said softly. The idea settled between them, not as a sudden revelation, but as the natural, inevitable next step in their journey. Their love was not a thing to be hoarded, but a resource to be shared. A family was not something they were waiting for. It was something they could choose to build. Their life together was a testament to a new kind of Western story, one where freedom was not just about open land, but about the right to define oneself, where dignity was not a birthright, but a thing to be earned and defended, where love was not a prize to be won, but a partnership to be forged. It was a story that proved a person's value is measured not by what they can produce, but by the courage with which they live, and the kindness they show to others. Cole looked down at her, his rough hand gently stroking her hair. "The day I paid your father's note," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. Was the day you redeemed all of Dustwater from its thirst? Ara smiled, a slow, gentle curve of her lips. She reached up and touched his weathered cheek. No, my love, she whispered. That was the day the water finally learned to flow in the right place. Outside, the wind whispered through the new grass in the pastures. From the barn came the faint, musical sound of laughter from the evening school. And from the heart of the ranch, the creek flowed on, a steady, constant murmur, carrying the promise of a bright and hopeful future, a quiet symphony of a life reclaimed. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to support us and help this story reach more people.